thank you very much for coming along again to EcoViews and News. This evening we want to cover a little bit of what's been happening very dramatically on the national scene since we last met, and it's pretty impressive in a way. That is, we have a lot of discourse but not a lot of forward action on something like climate change, and we're beginning to look at the problems of that because in effect the American people aren't being really told what's happening here, and instead of the election making it more clear, in fact it's making a lot less clear. And that's what we need to look at a bit tonight. The way in which there is a strategy afoot to keep us confused during an election period. This is hard to get hold of as an idea, but we ought to begin to realize that we're being sold a series of stories during this election period, some of which have nothing to do with what's actually going on in the climate, but have a lot more to do with what various candidates think they can sell to the American people as an electoral campaign. This is sad in a way, but it is the case that we're up against really pretty well-financed disinformation campaigns to keep the public not informed but confused about climate issues. And this is what we want to look at in detail today, because there is a strategy now being pursued in effect to move away from what we now know in the sciences, but what can appeal to the public in terms of belief systems. So we're going to look at the difference between evidence and judgment, which you would base on information and new kind of scientific data, versus confusion and belief. And what we're being sold is the confusion and belief systems kind of logic. And this is a strategy. It's a strategy of the climate change deniers in an election year. So we ought to be able to see the signs of this and in fact watch it unfold over the next 10 months. We're going to have pretty enormous demonstrations of this confusion and belief approach. Well, there has been a bit of a flurry about whether conservatives in general are of low intelligence and poor information, and a lot of this came from a series of articles that appeared in England. This one was in The Guardian with the title, "Conservatism Thrives on Low Intelligence and Poor Information," and it was based on a series of articles. One came out in the London Mail called "Right-Wingers Are Less Intelligent Than Left-Wingers," says study. And the study behind it actually appeared in a journal in Canada. It's worth tracing it down and looking what's said in detail on it. Bright minds, dark attitudes, and lower cognitive ability, that is lower intelligence, predicts greater prejudice through right-wing ideology and intergroup contact. Well, this is a kind of technical argument about whether people with low intelligence tests performances also subscribe to right-wing ideologies. I suppose you could argue they do, but I mean, the real question is the second part of this. It's the poor information. I think intelligence can be said to be pretty evenly distributed across any political spectrum. The question is what even intelligent people do with poor information. And in an election year, the kind of information we get is absolutely crucial. The kind of person who's been looking into this for a long time on climate issues is a former reporter, investigative reporter, and then editor at the Boston Globe, and you ought to know about him. Ross Gelbspan has written very powerfully on the disinformation campaigns that are being put out during any year, but especially important this election year, about climate. Listen to what he has to say. It's pretty staggering when you hear it in detail. He gives a very forceful account on his own website. Take a look. Let's see if we can get the sound to work for us here. because the sound is crucial, obviously. Let's pause it a second and find out what's happening to the sound here. Pause it a second again and get that to close. Here we go. We'll start it at the beginning because his statement is really quite important to get from the very beginning.
Paying some scientists under the table to say climate change isn't happening. And I said to myself, if there's this cover-up going on, what are they covering up? And there went the next 15 years of my life. So the impulse that propelled me into this work has nothing to do with the love of nature. It comes from a very deeply held belief on which I based a 30-year career that in a democracy we need honest information on which to base our decisions. And in this case, some very powerful interests were stealing our reality. And I know in my bones and from all my experience that bodes very, very badly for the democracy. And it turns out it also bodes very badly for the planet as well. We are standing at the threshold of runaway climate change. And the coming disruptions, which most scientists say are inevitable, will lead us either into a future of totalitarianism or into a new and unprecedented era of human cooperation. But first, a word from our sponsors. This climate crisis has been visited on us by huge coal and oil industries which have blocked any meaningful action on the climate for the last 20 years. Most regrettably, they have a powerful ally in a negligent and largely indifferent U.S. press.
Now that's the point. That is, the ally of these oil and coal and now natural gas industries are a largely negligent and somewhat ignorant U.S. press. Now he's saying this as a former editor at the Boston Globe. His accusation is not so much at the oil and coal industries, who he says you can expect will try to distort the truth, but it's the way in which the press has totally collapsed on this issue that angers him so much, and because the stakes are so high. Take a look.
Which has consistently failed to connect the warming to people whose crops are destroyed by weather extremes, whose homelands are going under from rising sea levels, and whose borders will be overrun by environmental refugees. I won't go through all the scientific findings and climate impacts that are surfacing almost weekly, but I would like to offer 3 large-gauge observations about global climate change. The first is its speed. We have all been absolutely blindsided by global warming. Global warming didn't even surface as a public issue until 1988. That's the year the United Nations set up the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and it's the same year that NASA scientist Jim Hansen told Congress that global warming is at hand. Today, a mere 20 years later, scientists are telling us we are approaching or already at a point of no return in terms of staving off climate crisis. That is an incredibly short period of time. The blink of an eye, historically speaking, for such enormous changes in these massive planetary systems. The second point that makes it so difficult to communicate this issue has to do with lag times and feedbacks. Carbon dioxide stays up there for 100 years. So a lot of the impacts we're seeing today are probably the result of emissions from the 1980s when India and China were just beginning their surge in coal-fired industrialization. This makes it virtually inevitable that we will see more catastrophes like Katrina or the European heat wave of 2003 that killed 35,000 people. The final point has to do with the extreme sensitivity of Earth's systems to just a little bit of warming. As we know, the glaciers are melting, the deep oceans are heating, violent weather's increasing, the timing of the seasons is changing, and all over the world, birds, plants, fish, insects, and animals are migrating toward the poles in search of stable temperatures, and all that has happened from 1 degree of warming. And for context, we're looking forward to a century of 4 to 10 degrees more heat. What we need is a rapid worldwide switch to non-carbon energy sources. to solar and wind and tidal and wave power and ultimately hydrogen fuels, and we need it yesterday. That doesn't mean we all have to sit in the dark and ride bicycles. These energy sources can give us all the power we use today and more. The fossil fuel lobby knows this better than anyone, and its response has been to protect the industry at the expense of the rest of us in general, and more specifically at the expense of the lifeblood of any democratic system, which is honest information. For nearly 20 years, the carbon lobby has mounted an extremely effective campaign of deception and disinformation designed to persuade the public and policymakers that the issue of global warming is stuck in uncertainty. That campaign for the longest time attacked the science, and in so doing, it marginalized the findings of more than 2,000 scientists from 100 countries reporting to the UN in what is the largest and most rigorously peer-reviewed scientific collaboration in history.
Okay. Well, you can see what Ross has been outraged about. It's the way in which the science has been subverted by the large fossil fuel industries, the carbon industries of coal and petroleum and, natural gas as it emerges. So it's the poor information question. It's not the intelligence that's involved here. It's this question of poor information. Now, we've talked about this in the past on previous programs. Back in 2010 in October, we looked at selling you myths, buying your reality. And we looked in particular at the impact of these two gentlemen here. Big oil times bad science equals global tragedy was the title of that one back in October again of 2010. But they're up to it again. They're the very same people. In fact, if you look at the Koch Industries, they held a meeting this last month that the New York Times described in these terms: a secretive network of Republican donors is heading to Palm Springs, California for a long weekend in January. But it will not be to relax after a hard-fought election. It will be to plan for the next one. And apparently they're putting up millions of dollars in order to engage in the same kind of disinformation campaigns that they've been so good at in the past. Take a look. Amy reported it.
The Huffington Post reports the conservative billionaires Charles and David Koch recently held a 3-day retreat in California to raise money to help defeat President Obama. Those who attended the retreat pledged to give $100 million. Charles Koch pledged $40 million. David pledged $20 million.
Okay, well, that's a lot of money. They have a lot of money. One brother gave $40 million, the other gave $20 million. Well, what are they up to? In fact, they're up to a lot of deception about climate change. An Australian journalist captured this in a report that he put out, and it's pretty interesting to watch how a foreign journalist will characterize it.
This is Charles and David Koch, oil barons with personal fortunes of over $21 billion each. But perhaps their greatest achievement is helping convince the world that global warming doesn't exist. In the early 1990s, a scientific consensus began to emerge that burning fossil fuels, such as oil and coal, was changing the Earth's climate. In order to protect profits, these industries devised a plan to reposition global warming as a theory and not fact, and designed what a recent Greenpeace report dubbed the climate change denial machine.
It's a network of corporations and think tanks, front groups, who try to lie about the climate science, stop policies that will solve global warming. Of all the dirty energy money that's coming into Washington trying to influence policies, Koch is the worst. Koch is the largest donor, and nobody's ever heard of him.
The denial machine works like this. As citizens, we generally don't trust what energy industry representatives tell us about climate change. But we do trust these messages when given to us by experts or by our peers. In 2007, Koch paid scientists to publish a bogus study that polar bears weren't being affected by climate change. They've invested millions of dollars turning George Mason University into what Mother Jones magazine called a haven for climate deniers, and even underwritten denier conferences. But while the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change brought together over 600 authors from 40 countries for their latest report, renowned skeptic Steve Malloy admits that his side is vastly outnumbered.
It's really amazing, and it's really sort of a band of about 25 people, I guess, maybe a few more. And most recent polls show that more people feel more strongly on my side than on the Al Gore side.
Well,
How
that's
would
pretty
such a
amazing.
small minority overcome an almost total
640,
consensus among
as it
climate
were,
scientists?
to 640 to 25, and yet they're winning. And why they're winning is that they buy up things like the opinions of the Wall Street Journal. They put out this fellow on the opinion pages, not the news pages, the opinion pages, a guy named James Friedman, puts out his opinion that there's no need to panic about global warming. He goes on and gives it the title, The Global Warming Hoax, as if that were a reality instead of a quote from someone. It's his opinion, and he interviews a guy who isn't a climate scientist at all. He's a physicist at Princeton, but he knows nothing about climate science, and he goes on to prove it by what he says. But they also buy opinion pieces in Forbes magazine, getting it out to the business community that there's an unsettling of the climate consensus on this. Well, this is pretty staggering. In fact, they succeeded in confusing journalists at the Voice of America who have actually led their science page with an article entitled Debate Over Global Warming, Climate Change Heats Up, as if there was really a debate anymore. Just because some people, like the 25 people instead of the thousands, are expressing their opinion again, their same old opinions. The climate scientists point out, look, don't talk to dentists if you want to find out about astrophysics. Don't talk to physicists who do nuclear work. If you want to talk about the climate, talk to climate scientists. If you do, and the Wall Street Journal carried their letter a few days later, if you talk to the climate scientists, there's no dispute going on here. But the dispute will be kept alive by people like Inhofe during this election year. He plans to publish a book later this month, which he's going to talk about with Sean Hannity on Fox News on the February 27th before it hits the newsstands on the 28th. But the idea here is to project the same old that he put out a while back about climate change. He published this about how people should cover it more thoroughly, by which he meant cover his own speeches on the floor of the Senate. His speeches, which were not informed by science, but were generally bashes of Al Gore. And he got, in fact, the religious right to sponsor. In fact, you could write for a copy of Jim Inhofe's speeches from the Thomas Road Baptist Church. Why? Well, because apparently this minister, Jerry Falwell, wanted to get that message out.
Myth of global warming. That statement alone will provoke 500 letters to the editor by the tree huggers and the liberals and everybody who gets upset at any challenge to the alarmism and the hysteria that's going on because of the claim that man-made global warming will bring an end to spring and summer and fall and winter. And
well, he goes on, and you can see that he doesn't believe in it. He actually says, well, I know long ago it should have been about science, but it's really about politics. Therefore, he says, let's read the Bible. Well, this is pretty staggering. He's not alone in this. In fact, the whole crowd, from Mitt Romney to Newt Gingrich to Ron Paul and, of course, Rick Santorum himself, have now come out against what they call the global warming myth. The problem is that it's all financed by this effort to keep the public confused. That's the strategy involved here. Confuse the public, confuse and get them to throw back on rather archaic beliefs. Well, keep in touch, online and on air. We'll see you.